So hi, everybody. My name is Jen Wheeler. I work for an organization called Street Law. I'll talk a little bit more about street law here in a moment, but we just wanted to thank you for joining us this afternoon or evening, depending on where you're coming to us from. This is part one of a two-part series for students about student speech. And tonight we're going to be covering the case Tinker v. Des Moines. But then we're going to talk at the end about another case that's actually a current case called Hanoi versus BL that we're going to offer a second webinar for. It's a case that's about Snapchat and student speech. Hopefully interesting to some, if not all of you. We are recording this webinar and the recording will be available. All participants are anonymous to each other, so we can't see your faces and no one in the webinar will be able to see your names. So this is our agenda for this 1 hour webinar. We'll just start with some welcomes and an overview of what we're doing. After that, we'll talk a bit about the facts of the Tinker versus Des Moines case, and then we're going to spend a lot of time with our special guest, Mary Beth Tinker, and you'll be able to submit questions that Mary Beth will answer. So these are the folks that are bringing you this webinar today. My colleague, Kathy Ruffing, who is waving.
Yeah, I'll say something. Hi, I'm Kathy. I'm the Senior Director of Teacher Professional Development Programs and Curriculum, which just means I do the teacher stuff and the book stuff along with Jen. And I taught in Fairfax County Public Schools for 27 years before I did this job. So shout out to my FCPS students out there.
And my name is Jen Wheeler. I work with Kathy and I was a middle school teacher. I hope we have some middle school students here with us and some middle school teachers with us as well. I taught in Baltimore City Public Schools. And I want to introduce our intern, Mary Liz.
Hi, I'm Mary Liz. I'm a senior at Herndon High School, and I'm an intern for Street Law this year for my political science class.
Thanks, Mary Liz. So this is who Street Law is. This is our mission statement. We have almost 50 years of experience developing programs and curricula that teach young people about the law and how to use it as a positive force in their lives. We do work in 5 areas: teacher professional development, legal community partnerships, legal life skills, global law and democracy programs, and curricula and teaching materials. And we have with us, of course, our special guest, Mary Beth Tinker. You can see that Mary Beth is a multifaceted person, obviously an advocate for student speech rights, not just in her childhood, but also to this day. She's a lifelong educator who speaks across the country to people about their rights. And she's also a retired pediatric nurse and active in DC local politics. Hi, Mary Beth.
Hi. It's so good to be with all of you. Thank you so much for inviting me.
We're lucky to have you. Thank you for coming. So these are a couple of the things that we hope to accomplish for today. By the end of today's session, students, we hope that you better understand the Tinker versus Des Moines case and that you start to get a little bit of a feel for what the Hanoi case is about. That's that current case about Snapchat. That you understand the facts, the constitutional issues, the precedents, and the arguments of these cases, and that you're starting to be able to draw a connection between the Tinker case and the Hanoi case. With that, I will turn it over to Kathy, who's going to talk a bit about the facts.
Okay, so when we talk about Supreme Court cases, we always start by looking at the Constitution and which parts of the Constitution are going to be involved in the deciding of that case. So the Supreme Court has to decide and interpret the Constitution. So of course, this is a First Amendment case, and we pulled out the important language from the First Amendment that Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. So that seems pretty simple, but we do know from our everyday lives that there are lots of times when your speech can be restricted. So the Supreme Court has to decide when that is appropriate and when that isn't appropriate. So we'll come back to the language of that several times while Mary Beth is talking. So Tinker v. Des Moines was not the first case that had to do with student speech or students' rights in schools. So there were, and either was West Virginia State Board of Education v. Barnett, but this case sets an important precedent. This case was about flag salutes in the 1940s. So this is during World War I. It's a time when patriotism, or World War II, it's a time when patriotism is important. And so the government has an interest in increasing patriotism by the pledge, the salute of the flag. So you can see the students saluting the flag there, very different than you do if your school does it. Kind of looks like maybe something the Germans made famous with the Heil Hitler sign, which is why it changes over time in the 50s to get away from this to the hand over the heart. But this case becomes important because there were some students who were Jehovah's Witnesses, and it was against their religion to have to pledge allegiance to anything other than God. And so the school forcing them, mandating them to stand up and salute the flag was a conflict of two of their First Amendment rights, their right to freedom of religion and their right to speak, or in this case, not to speak, to not be compelled to speak. And this case found for the students that they had those two rights, that the school could not force them to stand or salute the flag. And this becomes an important precedent in the Tinker case that Mary Beth will talk about. There was a case just a couple years before this where the Supreme Court actually decided exactly the opposite thing. And the fallout, it was called the Gobitis case. And the fallout was so bad that just 2 years later, they essentially heard the same issue and found this time for the students that students do retain those rights in school. The other part of the Constitution that's going to be important in what Mary Beth is about to discuss is the 14th Amendment. So you noticed in the language of the First Amendment that it said Congress cannot do those things, but Congress wasn't making the decisions in Mary Beth's school. They didn't suspend Mary Beth from class. So the first thing we have to do is apply that to the states. And the 14th Amendment does that. You can see the language, no state shall make or enforce any law, which shall abridge the privileges or immunities. The privileges are your rights in the Bill of Rights. These cases also have a component of the Equal Protection Clause that you see there at the end of the 14th Amendment that says that states can't deny any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. So for instance, can you tell one group of students they can wear armbands, but another group they can't? Or can you treat students in school differently than you would out of school? So there's equal protection issues in this case as well. So I'm going to now turn it over to Mary Liz and Mary Beth, who share a common name, to tell the story of this case.
Mary Beth, your case is about whether the First Amendment protected you, your brother, and your friend from being suspended for wearing black armbands to school. Can you start by telling us why you wore the armbands to school?
Yes, thank you, Mary Liz. Well, we wore the armbands to school. They didn't have those cute little peace signs on there at first. That was later on that we added those. They were just plain black armbands. And for me, the idea probably started really when, well, young people have been speaking up forever and being in the forefront of pushing for us to live up to our ideals. And so some of those kids were the Birmingham children at the Birmingham Children's Crusade. And that year, thousands of students in Birmingham, Alabama spoke up against racism. They were kind of the Black Lives Matter of our time. And I saw them on the news thanks to the free press. And I thought they were amazing and brave and strong, especially because when the white supremacists went after them and attacked them with German Shepherd dogs and with fire hoses that were opened up with the water double strength, the students just kept on speaking and singing their freedom songs like "This Little Light of Mine, I'm Gonna Let It Shine." I thought they were just amazing, but I knew I was not like them because I was very shy. And what happened was when those kids then, that was in May of 1963. And then in August, there was the March on Washington, big march for racial justice. And that was August. And then in September, to punish the children, the white supremacists bombed their headquarters, which was the 16th Street Baptist Church. And 4 little girls were murdered. Cynthia, Addie Mae, Carol, and Denise. And those kids were about the same ages as me and my sisters. Someone came by our picnic to tell us what had happened to these brave kids. So the writer, James Baldwin, he had an idea, what if we all wear black armbands to mourn for the little girls? And a man named Bayard Rustin, he was a leader in the civil rights movement too. He joined in on the idea. And so all over the country, people wore black armbands that year when I had just turned 11 years old. And there's me in the middle, and my sister Bonnie and Hope are there. And on the left, our friends Phyllis and Linda. Their mother was an amazing woman too, who spoke up for her rights after she came back from World War II as a veteran and could not sit at the local drugstore and have a drink of soda pop. So that's Linda and Phyllis and us. So that was us at the memorial service for the 4 little girls in Birmingham. And that was my first experience with black armbands. But then 2 years later, the Vietnam War was building up and thousands, well, yeah, a lot happened in the meantime too. That's a Freedom Summer. That was 1964. It was mighty times with so much going on, just like now. 1964 was Freedom Summer, and students came from all over the country to try to register African-American voters in Mississippi because this reign of terror was stopping Black voters from registering to vote. If they tried to register to vote, their house could be burned down, they could be lynched, they could lose their jobs. And so young people who have such great courage and sense of fairness, they went to Mississippi that year. About 700 young people went to Mississippi that year when I was 12 years old. And let's see, what's the next one, Mary Liz? Oh yeah. Oh gosh, well, what happened when they got there, these young people got to Mississippi, 3 of them immediately disappeared and were killed again by the white supremacists, by the Ku Klux Klan and the White Citizens Council. Their names were Cheney, James Cheney, Mickey Schwerner, and Andrew Goodman. But the very same day that the bodies of those 3 young men were found in 1964, off the coast of Vietnam, a US Navy ship, this picture is of President Johnson signing the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, which was so important in the Vietnam War and was going on all at the same time because the same day the bodies were found of Cheney, Schwerner, and Goodman. Off the coast of Vietnam, a US Navy ship claimed that it had been attacked, the USS Maddox. And it turns out it wasn't attacked, but it didn't stop the Congress then from voting almost unanimously to start sending thousands more troops to Vietnam. The war was already going on, but it was kind of under the radar of the American public, didn't know much about it. So that year in August, right after Cheney, Schwerner, and Goodman were killed, President Johnson signed that Gulf of Tonkin resolution. So by the next Christmas, yeah, that's me and my sisters, Hope and Bonnie. Well, my dad was a Methodist preacher, and then we also got involved with the Quakers, which is another religion that's all about peace. So at Christmas time, my dad would read from the Bible about the message of hope and love that is at the heart of all religions, really. But by that Christmas, we didn't see hope and love. We saw war. 1965. I was in 8th grade by then. And so we heard about an idea, some high school kids were going to wear black armbands again. But this time it would be to mourn for the dead. The idea of black armbands goes way back in history. If someone died, even in the Civil War, if someone died, the family would wear a black armband to show that they were sad and they were grieving. And so we heard about this idea to wear black armbands again, but this time it would be to mourn for the dead in Vietnam, not the Birmingham children this time. And it would be mourning for the dead on both sides of the war. And that's one thing that made it kind of controversial. Well, the idea that kids would speak up in general was kind of controversial. And then war is controversial. So you put it all together. It's this case about how to deal with controversy also. But that, and then our other message was that the adults should have a truce in the war that Christmas. They should stop the war and try to figure out a way to negotiate with the Vietnamese so that they could not continue the war. So that was our message. Number one, grieving for the dead in the war, including the Vietnamese. And number two, calling for a truce that Christmas that was being called for by Senator Robert Kennedy. And we thought that was a good idea. See, kids are so logical. Like, why don't you all stop fighting and try to negotiate? So that's me at the school board meeting, and my mother is there beside me, and behind me is my father. My dad didn't think we should wear the armbands because when he heard that the principals made a rule against armbands, which they did, and he said, well, you know, these principals have a job to do. I don't think that you should necessarily wear those armbands to school, but we knew something about our dad. He taught us to speak up for what we believe in, and he was a minister, and he preached about love and understanding, and he taught us that we should put that into our lives and not just talk about it. You should put it into action. So we convinced him that it was really important to us to wear the armbands, to speak up about the war. So that's us at the school board meeting. But we tried to change their mind, but they wouldn't change their mind. So that's what happened.
What was the school's reaction to you wearing the armbands?
Well, when I got to, I mean, I was the shyest kid you could imagine, but I felt really sad about the war. And it's really a story also about how young people, like all of you who are here today, you have feelings about things. And it's good for you to express them, and it's natural that you want to express them. But you know, not everybody is comfortable hearing what you have to express, but eventually the Supreme Court said, well, we just have to be willing to be uncomfortable sometimes because it's important for people to express themselves. But the school, yeah, they made this rule against armbands. And so when I got there, I was sent to the office and asked to take off my armband, which I did. But I was suspended anyway. That's the day I learned that you don't have to be the bravest person in the world. You can be you can be shy, you can be scared, and you can still do something. Now this is about the court system. So after we wore the armbands and we got suspended, 5 kids got suspended. And so some people got really, really mad at us and they're like, you kids don't know anything. Some adults are always going to say that. As I found out later, the adults didn't know very much about Vietnam at all. Most adults couldn't even find Vietnam on a map. It was 1965. There had been about 1,000 US soldiers killed in the war. And eventually there would be 58,000 killed directly in the war, but many, many more, even today. As a result of the war. But regardless, so some people got really mad at us for doing that. They said we were unpatriotic. They said we must be communists. We'd say, no, we're actually Methodists. We're not communists. And it was just crazy. But some people that came to help us was the American Civil Liberties Union people and the group. The ACLU, they go to the Supreme Court more than any organization in the United States. And so they offered to help. And they said, well, first you've got to go back to the school board and always try to negotiate first. You don't just want to go to court if you can help it. And so we went back to the school board, but they wouldn't change their mind. So then it went to the district court. Now, to get into the federal court system, because there's civil courts, like if somebody steals your wallet, you're not going to end up in the federal court system. But to get into the federal court system, it's got to be an issue that involves the Constitution. So our lawyers from the ACLU, we had a very wonderful lawyer named Dan Johnston, who was very young, right out of Drake Law School in Des Moines, Iowa, where we lived. And so he said, well, the issue is the First Amendment and the 14th Amendment. So this belongs in federal court. And I hope that makes sense to everyone. Federal court, it's got to involve the Constitution. Okay, so it went to district court. And our lawyers argued, and the school board lawyers, argued, oh, the school is the one, the school administrators get to decide what's discussed in school. We argued back and forth, and we lost. Okay, then right about that, now this is kind of interesting. I'll try to make this brief, but what happened is kind of important to all of you, because right around that time, there was a case working its way through the courts in Mississippi, where students had worn buttons to school to protest the KKK murders of Cheney, Schwerner, and Goodman. Remember I told you about how those 3 young guys were murdered in Mississippi during Freedom Summer, trying to help register African-American voters. James Cheney was Black, the other 2 were white. They were murdered. Okay, some high school kids that year in Mississippi in 1964 wore buttons to school to protest, and the buttons said "One man, one vote," SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. That was the organization, SNCC. SNCC is one of the most important organizations in the history of our country. Okay, so when they wore these buttons to school that fall of 1964, after the murders, they were told they could not do that. It was an all-Black school. They were Black students. And a case started working its way through the courts for them. And they said, wait, we should have been allowed to wear those buttons to school. It's First Amendment, free speech. Okay, they ended up winning at the appeals court level. The middle court, the appeals court. Right before we lost at the appeals court, they won at the appeals, in their appeals court. I hope you're following. There's 2 appeals courts. One's in Iowa, one's in Mississippi. There's actually 13 in the country. 2 different appeals courts ruled different things on the same issue. So you see how adults can disagree about these things. That's why I'm glad you students are learning and studying all this, because it's not like there's some adult somewhere that knows all the answers to these things. Okay, so you have 2 appeals courts disagreeing. That's called a circuit split, because those are called the circuit courts, the appeals courts, a circuit split. So it was the perfect situation for the ACLU to appeal our case to the Supreme Court. And they said, let's let the Supreme Court decide which one is right. So that's what happened. And they had to decide, number 1, our armband speech, because did it even fall under the idea of free speech? And yes, the court has ruled in a number of cases that there is symbolic speech, which should also be protected as free speech. Probably some of you are wearing symbols today on your shirts or necklace or whatever. So that was one of the issues they had to decide. And they also had to decide, is the First Amendment for students? Because nobody ever thought these rights covered students particularly. Yes, there had been that West Virginia case versus Barnett saying that you cannot force students to say the Pledge of Allegiance. That was in 1943. But besides that, there hadn't really been any First Amendment cases at the Supreme Court having to do with students. There are other cases at the Supreme Court having to do with other rights. But this one, we're talking about the First Amendment.
What was the constitutional issue at question, particularly in your case?
The constitutional issue was, do the rights of students differ in the school setting than the rights of adults or others outside of school? And so what is the limit of the schools to discipline students and to censor student speech? Now, one of the ways that we won the case, yeah, that's the front page of the New York Times. The day we won was February 24th, 1969. And when those students won in Mississippi, when they won at the appeals court, this was very important. Why did they win? Because the judges in Mississippi in the appeals court said they should win because they had not substantially disrupted school. Okay? So in our ruling, here's our ruling from the Supreme Court, then a couple years later, it was ruled on at the Supreme Court, our case, and they cited that Mississippi case. It's called Burnside. And they said basically, just like the Burnside students who did not substantially disrupt school and therefore should have had a right, the Tinker students also did not disrupt school, and they should win too. There were 3 of us on the case, by the way, my brother John and I, and a boy named Chris Eckhart. Those are called plaintiffs. The plaintiffs are the ones who take it to court. So yes, the decision was that if there's not a really, really good reason to regulate the speech, students are entitled to freedom of expression, and it can hardly be argued that students or teachers shed their constitutional rights to freedom of speech or expression at the schoolhouse gate. That was Justice Abe Fortas. It was a 7-2 decision, a very strong, beautiful decision written to describe what education should be in a democracy. And it was also affirming the respect for students in saying that, for example, it says that students are persons under our Constitution with the rights and responsibilities of persons. They said there are 2 things that students could not do with their First Amendment rights in school, and that was number 1, to substantially disrupt school. And for that, they cited the Burnside case from Mississippi. And number 2, impinge on the rights of others. You cannot impinge on the rights of others with your free speech rights, because we have to balance the rights of others with our rights. And what that means and what it meant has been debated ever since. What impinges on the rights of others? That's the day that we won the case. We had just moved to a new city, St. Louis, from Des Moines. And that's my little brother, Paul. He even wore an armband to 2nd grade. And he said, we want peace. Kids want peace. And my sister Hope had worn an armband to 5th grade, but they didn't get suspended. So that was the day. It was hard to be real happy on the day we won, though, because it was one of the worst years for the Vietnam War. And thousands of people were being injured and killed. So it was kind of tempered with some sadness as well. Yes, so then after that, that was the test. Yes, you could have your free speech in schools, but you could not substantially disrupt school. And remember, that came from the Mississippi students, the Black students who spoke up and stood up with great courage to the Ku Klux Klan to speak up for racial justice there. And so the substantial disruption test was the standard for some years. And then there were other cases that came. Well, that one on the left is girls, and maybe there's some boys in there too, wearing bracelets that said "I heart boobies." That was a big case a few years ago in Pennsylvania and Indiana. That was kind of interesting because the students won the right to wear those bracelets. It was about breast cancer. And this is really what this case is about. Do you have a right to advocate for your own interests as a youth, as a young person? Should you have a right to speak up about breast cancer? Yes, that's going to affect your life. It had already affected a lot of those students' lives who were wearing those bracelets. So the Pennsylvania Appeals Court ruled in favor of the students. And then a district court in Indiana ruled against the students. So that was the end of that. That wasn't appealed, and it never got to the Supreme Court. Now, then there was Bethel versus Frazier was in 1986. That was first case for free speech that came after ours that went to the Supreme Court that tested the First Amendment rights. And that year, a boy stood up and made a speech in the auditorium. He was running for the student body president, Matthew Frazier. And his speech had all these sort of sexy innuendos in there. He didn't actually say things, but he sort of implied some things. And so he was punished for that, and it ended up at the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled against him. It wasn't a unanimous decision, though. Thurgood Marshall, Justice Stevens voted for him. But under that ruling, basically what came of that is that now, not only can you not substantially disrupt school or impinge on the rights of others, you cannot say obscene speech in school, okay? Now the Confederate flag has to do more with impinging on the rights of others, because there's never been a case that I know of where Confederate flags have won, or the right to wear a Confederate flag or have a Confederate flag in school has won. Why? Because it impinges on the rights of other students to feel safe in school, because of all this history of the white nationalists and the Ku Klux Klan and how they bombed the Birmingham children and killed them, and they killed Cheney, Shorn, and Goodman. And those people, they have flag that they would usually fly when they were doing those things, and it represented their white supremacy. So the Confederate flag has to do with the impinging on the rights of others. And then the bong hits for Jesus, well, probably between Bethel versus Frazier and the bong hits for Jesus case, there was a very important case called Hazelwood versus Kuhlmeyer, where it was probably the most harmful case for students' rights. It had to do with school journalism and school newspapers. And the court ruled that if the speech, what you're saying is under a school sponsored program, like a school journalism program or a dance club or something like that, the school has more of a right to censor you. But however, 13 states have campaigned and convinced their legislatures to pass laws saying, no, actually, we're going to support our student journalists. And so that's called the New Voices campaign. And so that's a very interesting campaign. Last year, Illinois was one of the most recent states to rule in favor of student journalism, or not to rule, but to pass legislation. And that's a student-led campaign. It's part of the Student Press Law Center, which is a group that stands up for student journalists. So then the last case after us was the Bong Hits for Jesus case, which was also called Morris v. Frederick. And that was decided in 2007, where students held up that banner outside of their school as the Olympic torch came by in Juneau, Alaska. And the court ruled against their right to do that. And the upshot of that case was the court saying that, by the way, you also cannot advocate for illegal drugs in school. That case was not unanimously decided either at the Supreme Court. But one significant thing in that ruling was that Clarence Thomas, one of the justices on the Supreme Court, said in his opinion that actually the whole Tinker ruling should be overruled, and that there's nothing in our Constitution that says that students have rights or that young people have rights. So that was the Bong Hits for Jesus. So that's the story. And now we've got one more case coming up soon at the Supreme Court, the Hanoi case. And I know you all are studying about that too. It's a very interesting case from Pennsylvania, looking at whether your out of school speech is how far the purview of the school goes when it comes to your out of school speech or your speech on social media.
So I'm going to interrupt for just a moment to let all the students know that we're about to move into the question and answer portion of this webinar. And if you look down toward the bottom of your Zoom screen, you should see a little icon that says Q&A there, and you can ask your questions in that Q&A. Unfortunately, we disabled the comment and the upvote, but you can ask your questions, and then Mary Liz will be asking Mary Beth some of the questions that you put into the Q&A.
Great. Yeah, I can't wait to hear your questions. And you can make comments if you want also, students. Tell me some things you're speaking up about.
Well, I guess we'll start. I have a question for you that I would just want to know.
Great.
Especially right now, what do you think we should do to make sure we're preserving democracy, our freedom of speech, and other rights?
Yes, it's so important because I always feel like, well, I'm a nurse, and so I feel like, your rights are like your muscles. If you don't use them, you can lose them. So we have to use our rights. So, number one is paying attention to what's going on in the country, in the world, in your community. Who are making the decisions that you care about? Earlier today, I was talking to some high school kids who were talking about trans rights and they care about that. And I said, well, yeah, find out, what your representatives believe about that. Do you agree with them? Whatever the issue is, if it's the climate, if it's racism, if it's your schools, you can find out what your local representatives think about it, what your senator, your representative, your school board member thinks about it. Pay attention, and then you can get involved. You can, speak up. You can use social media, or you can testify at county council, or, different ways of doing things. And as I found out, it's a good way of life. You connect with other people who care about things, and some days it's even fun.
Okay, what is your view on modern day youth activism? Do you think that youth activism has increased or decreased over the years?
Well, I think it's pretty, youth are very active right now, and it's so heartening. It's so wonderful to see. I mean, you're connected with students, not only here in this country, but all over the world who are speaking up, because this is an international human rights issue, the rights of young people, the rights of youth. And in our country, sadly, youth don't really get a fair deal, because you can just look at things like what age group is most likely to live in poverty. Kids and teenagers. I mean, I've taken care of so many kids who have asthma because of the air being polluted, polluters, running wild, just doing whatever they feel like, water pollution, climate problems, school budgets being cut. And, war, the war economy, which is sucking up all the money too often that could be used for young people. And so I think it's really important for young people to speak up for your own interests and to advocate for yourselves.
How did the popularity of the case affect your school experience? How did it affect your personal growth and make you who you are today?
Well, I didn't realize that it was going to be such a big deal. I mean, I was just the most ordinary person you could imagine. And also, it wasn't just me that did it. It was a group project. There was actually the older kids at the high school planned it at Roosevelt High School. And there were 50 kids signed up to wear the black armbands. But then when the principals heard about it and made a rule against it, the number dropped way down. So yeah, I didn't realize it was going to be a big deal. I don't think any of us did. We had no idea we were going to be talking about it 50 years later, and that it was going to be considered a landmark case for youth rights and for students' rights. But it did affect my life because, I mean, it kind of defined my life in a lot of ways, because I was able to, well, I would have been working with young people anyway, because I like young people, I like kids. So I became a nurse and I worked mostly with kids, but I was able to put that together, the health of young people, your health, your physical health, your mental health, together with the idea of your rights. And so that was a very interesting combination, because as it turns out, when you speak up and advocate for yourselves, it's good for your health. It's good for your physical health. It's good for your mental health, your social health. Like the students who are speaking up against gun violence, the March for Our Lives students. I mean, that's having a major effect on the health of students. And not only to cut back on gun violence, but just the action of using your voice and speaking up is good for you.
Were you afraid of the repercussions you would face for speaking up, specifically repercussions in school or among your peers?
Yes, I was afraid of repercussions. I was pretty much afraid of everything. I was kind of this really shy kid, as I said. And I was nervous about the vice principal when he told me to take off that armament. I was nervous about my math teacher. I wasn't sure what my dad would say, but we convinced him because he had told us to speak up for what we believe in. And then I was afraid of these sort of crazy, dangerous people who started sending us threatening letters, and they threw red paint at our house. They called, yeah, that's one of them. That's a postcard. They called us communists. My mom would always say, "We're not communists, we're Methodists." And this lady called me on the phone and asked, "Is this Mary Beth Tinker?" And I said, "Yes." And she said, "I'm going to kill you." I mean, it was really baffling as a kid because it's Christmas time and we're speaking up for peace. And people are so mad about that they're threatening to kill us. And they're calling us communists. That's what that red thing is. But some people think that they get to decide what's patriotic. And they think they get to be the ones to decide what is spoken about and what is not. So that was kind of scary. It was really the adults that bullied us more than anything. The kids didn't really bother us that much.
Do you have any advice for how to speak out when you are scared or shy? I often find myself wanting to advocate for issues, but I am not confident enough or don't want to face negative attention.
Yes, I can relate to that feeling so much. And I mean, I feel that way even today a lot of times. I don't know what to do. Don't know exactly who to connect with or try to connect about some issue that I really care about. So I would say think about an issue that you care about and then just do a little research, look around, see who is already working on that. And maybe you'll get some inspiration, from seeing what's already going on. Maybe there's a way you can connect. Maybe somebody wrote a letter about it and you can, contact them, say you'd also like to do that. Or maybe in your school, there's some issue you care about. You could start a club. There's been a lot of students starting groups lately having to do with anti-racism, and I'm really glad to see that. So yeah, you could start a club. You could start like current events club or, just little by little, but I can totally understand, that feeling. But the good thing is when you start doing something, you start digging into it a little bit. And let's say you care about water pollution or you care about, earth, you want earth to be healthy, then look into it, see what groups are around. There's so many young people who are speaking up. There's Fridays for the Future. There's the Sunrise Movement. There's the Dreamers are working on immigration. There's just so many different things that you could get involved with. And it's good. It's a good way of life. And also, I want to tell you something. If you do some project about some issue in your community and research a little bit and try to take some action, you could probably get school credit for it. If you write up something, you find out who makes the decision, even if it's something, about your clothing to wear, whatever.
Okay, I feel like this was kind of a big one this year, but how do you feel about freedom of speech on social media specifically?
Yeah, freedom of speech on social media. Well, of course, there are ethics involved with any kind of speech that you're going to say something. So, you want to think about what's the goal? We're trying to make a world here where people have more understanding and where people get along better and where we, make things better in the world, not make things worse. So there's ethics, and then there's the legal, there's the law, and they don't always necessarily go together. So yeah, you want to, be careful what you say and say things with respect. And then media literacy, learn how to discern what is true and what is not true. on social media. That's really important. I'm so heartened to see a lot of schools have started media literacy programs and classes. And then as far as where the limit should be, I think students, should think about it and weigh in also, because it's not like, adults have all the answers on these things. I think that if there's a true threat that's given on social media, there should definitely be a limit there. But I think that there should be basically more dialogue and less censorship. But I also think students should weigh in. You should be the ones to help decide what should be allowed and what shouldn't be allowed.
How do you think the application of the Tinker case might change now that many schools are being conducted remotely and hybrid?
Yes, well, that's the big question. That the Tinker ruling said that you do not leave your constitutional right to expression at the schoolhouse gate. It didn't really cover what happens outside of school and what you say or do outside of school. So the virtual experience has really, made it interesting because, well, there are issues having to do with, do you have to turn your camera on in your class? Do you have to wear certain things when you're on virtually? Can you have a poster in back, that says Black Lives Matter? Can a teacher have a poster? There was a big issue with that earlier in the year. Some students complained, I think this was in Michigan, I'm trying to remember. Anyway, these students, they succeeded too. They were saying that, wait a minute, now you're saying we have a dress code. School was in session, but you're not requiring students to keep their masks on, but you're saying we can't show our shoulders in school. So, there are those kinds of issues as schools get back in session live again. But there are many issues having to do with virtual school that are different than before. The basic concept of the Tinker ruling is that you should have a say in the decisions that affect your life. And I believe you should have a say in how these things are decided.
Have you met anyone that had a case in the Supreme Court after your case?
Yes, I met a few people. Well, Kathy Kuhlmeyer from the Hazelwood case, we've become friends. So I met her. I met Matthew Frazier from the Bethel versus Frazier. I only talked to Joseph Frederick from the Bong Hits for Jesus case on the phone. We had, by the way, all those three cases that came after ours at the Supreme Court and the Hanoi case versus BL, those are all ACLU cases at the American Civil Liberties Union. So yeah, the ACLU set up a phone call between the two of us. It was very interesting talking to Joseph Frederick. I also met a man named Alton Lemon. He was involved with an important Supreme Court case that had to do with religious expression and the separation of church and state. Let's see if I met any others. I don't think I've met any other Supreme. Oh wait, I did meet Savannah Redding. There was a case recently in 2007, I think it was decided, having to do with whether students could be strip searched in public schools. And this girl's name was Savannah Redding. She was in 8th grade also in Arizona, and she was accused by a friend of having ibuprofen in her pocket, so she was strip searched. And that went to the Supreme Court and she won. And the Supreme Court said, no, we're not going to strip search students in the United States. So yeah, I got to be friends with her also.
Okay, I have another question. What advice do you have for people who feel like their rights have been violated and might want to pursue legal action?
Yes, if you feel your rights have been violated, you can talk to someone that you trust. You can talk to a couple of students, see what they think. You can talk to an adult. And depending on the level of how your rights were violated, when you talk to an adult, like a teacher, a counselor, a principal, a school nurse, someone like that. As a nurse, I know that certain occupations are required by law to do something about it. If they hear that, for example, in cases of abuse, if you tell an adult, one of those adults, they are required to do something about it. So it depends on the level of how your rights were violated. A lot of times you can solve the problem by, you know, getting a few people together and going to talk to the person who violated your rights, or if it's an adult, going to the adult that violated your rights. You know, so, and in some cases you may have to pursue legal action. You can contact the ACLU in your locality. You know, the ACLU is very active in every state of the United States, and they are big supporters of the rights of students.
Do you think schools should be allowed to make you sign contracts for extracurricular activities, even if these contracts limit your freedom of speech?
Very interesting. Well, that's kind of like what happened in Hanoi, actually, because the student had to sign a contract saying that, I think she wouldn't it's like put down the cheerleading group or something like that. And she won her case, went to court. She won, it was an ACLU case. She won at the district level and she won at the appeals level. And the appeals court said that you cannot force students to make contracts that violate the First Amendment. Okay, so the school didn't like that ruling, so they appealed it to the Supreme Court. And that's where it's at right now. It's under appeal to the Supreme Court. So we'll see what they say. But it doesn't seem like you should be able to require someone to make a contract that violates their First Amendment right. Now, you have to remember, all rights have limits. Like Kathy Ruffing said earlier, the First Amendment has limits. The Second Amendment has limits. All rights have limits because other people have rights too. So we have to balance the rights, our rights, with other people's rights also.
How do you feel about the Hanoi case versus BL case, and how does it relate to your case?
The Hanoi case, it has to do with whether, with the Tinker standard, basically, of substantially disrupting school, and that is not covered by the First Amendment rights enjoyed by students under Tinker, and impinging on the rights of others, and whether or not that standard holds up when the student is out of school. Like if the student does something on social media that then can be claimed to disrupt school, should the student be punished? Should the student be censored? I mean, I'm still kind of working out how I feel about all of it. And there's something called an amicus brief that people can file, private citizens, people, anyone can file a brief with their opinion. And so we're working on one right now, my brother John and I, and a lawyer friend. So we're going to be thinking a lot about what we think about it. But I think it could be dangerous if the court rules that your anything you do outside of school can be punished or censored by the school. That seems way too much power on the part of the school. And also the other thing is, a lot of principals and teachers, I mean, they don't want to be responsible for all your social media, first of all. So maybe there should be the standard, like, you know, if there's a true threat on social media, then the school should be able to get involved. But I think there should be limits to how much the school can be involved in your out of school speech.
Mary Beth, I think that's going to have to be the last question because we only have 5 minutes left. But you know, I always want you to show the actual armband. I'm sure the students would appreciate it. And maybe you could tell them where it's been, where it's going.
Yes, students, it was so good to be with all of you tonight, and best wishes with everything. I want you to take care of yourselves. Give yourselves a little pep talk. Tell yourselves how wonderful you are, because you are. Stay healthy, drink some juice, wear your masks. Yeah, so here's the armband. That picture is from the museum which was a news museum in Washington, D.C. that closed recently. Probably some of you have been there. It was a wonderful museum. But they had when I went back to school that January, I had to write a report on what I did during Christmas vacation. So I wrote my report, and here it is. And then it was in that museum for a while. But it was in the, and then, so yeah, this is the armband. And when the museum closed, I had to take back the armband. So it's going to be at the 8th Circuit Court of Appeals Museum, First Amendment Museum. Here it is. Yeah.
Thank you.
Heading to St. Louis. The actual, it's so funny that I pasted the armband into this report. Yeah, maybe you get extra credit for that. But I hope all of you get extra credit for being with us all tonight, or some kind of credit. And I hope you found it interesting. I'm sure you did. And thank you to Street Law for setting this up. And thank you to Mary Liz and to everyone who helped to make this happen.
Yes, thank you so much, Mary Beth, for being with us and being so sharing of your pictures of your childhood. It's really great to see all of those pictures, and I'm sure everybody feels like they got to know you in this hour. So a case that came up a lot during our talk tonight with Mary Beth is the Hanoi Area School District, VBL. And if you want to find some more information about it, Jen just put a link in chat that will take you to our SCOTUS in the Classroom page. It's kind of directed at teachers, but there's no reason you can't use that as a student. And it will tell you lots of information about this case. And you can go to the briefs after the oral arguments happen. You'll be able to listen to the oral arguments from there. It's sort of a one-stop shop. We hope that you will consider joining us 2 weeks from now when we have another student webinar on Hanoi. It will be all about that case, and our special guest for that is going to be the attorney that Mary Beth talked about, who's writing the amicus brief for her and her brother. He is an expert on First Amendment law. He's done a lot of really interesting cases about campus speech. And he will be he'll be joining us, so you can ask him all your legal questions about that case, and he might even tell us how he thinks it's going to come out. That case will be argued April 28th. So it'll be argued April 28th. It'll probably be one of the very last cases decided this term. So look for a decision at, mid-June for that case. So we also wanted you to know about landmarkcases.org. This is a website we have that has information about 20 cases. I'm going to show you all 20 cases. If you're an AP government student, there's a lot of the 15 required cases, not all, but a lot of them. And we wanted to tell you about it because until just recently, it was also a website that was set up for teachers, not for students. But when the pandemic hit, we realized that students would need to do a lot of work on their own, or teachers would need to be able to send students straight to the website to do work. So now you can go and you can see that little circle. You can go and it says for students, and it's going to take you to all sorts of resources on these cases. With explanations written at different reading levels. So you can choose your reading level, whatever fits you. It doesn't have to be one size fits all. And Tinker v. Des Moines is one of the cases on the landmark cases. You can see the other 20. Are there new cases or Obergefell v. Hodges, Schenck v. US, which is a required AP case, and Engel v. Vitale, which is a required case. Obergefell is not, but should be. But that's just my editorial. And if you want to know what it's going to look like when you get there for the student view, it's going to look like this. So you can see all of these activities, including things about the case Morse v. Frederick that Mary Beth talked about. And I wouldn't be too surprised if before long we have a Hanoi activity up there as well. So we want to thank you all so much for attending. We want to thank Mary Liz for guiding us through the questions. And of course, we want to thank Mary Beth Tinker for taking time out to talk about her case and answer your questions. Have a great night.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.